I never liked flying, not because of some irrational fear of heights or claustrophobia. I'd been on enough planes as a journalist to push through the discomfort. But it was the waiting, the sense of being trapped in a steel tube with 100 strangers, the thin, recycled air. It made me uneasy. Still, I hadn't expected this. The turbulence had started subtly. Just a few shakes that had the flight attendants reassuring everyone over the intercom. I barely looked up from my notebook. Then, the seatbelt sign flashed on, and the bumps grew violent. The overhead bins rattled. A woman across the aisle clutched her stomach, her face pale. Then a sickening lurch. The plane dropped. Screams erupted as people clung to their armrests. The cabin lights flickered, and the aircraft pitched violently to the side. My stomach shot into my throat as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Someone shouted over the intercom, but I could barely hear over the chaos. We were falling. The businessman beside me, mid-50s, a Rolex flashing on his wrist, had gone sheet white. "This can't be happening," he muttered, gripping the seat in front of him. A teenage boy across the aisle sobbed into his mother's chest. The world outside the window was a blur of gray clouds and snow-covered peaks. The plane groaned as if it was tearing apart. Then, a deafening snap. The left wing sheared off. The plane spun. Weightlessness swallowed me as people were ripped from their seats. Bodies, luggage, trays, everything slammed into the walls. Someone crashed into me, knocking the air from my lungs. The last thing I saw was the mountains rising fast. Then blackness. Pain dragged me back to reality. A ringing filled my ears. The taste of blood thickened my tongue. My entire body ached, the kind of deep, unrelenting pain that told me I was still alive, but barely. I was lying in snow. The cold was unbearable. Every inhale burned like knives in my chest. Forcing my eyes open, I saw twisted metal, debris, and bodies. They were everywhere, half buried in the snow, contorted unnaturally, some still strapped to their seats. Others torn apart by the impact. I wanted to vomit, but my body was too weak. The wreckage was scattered across the mountainside. Half of the fuselage split open like a gutted animal. Smoke curled into the icy air. The tail section was nowhere in sight. Somehow I was alive. A movement nearby snapped me out of my daze. A woman, mid-40s, short blonde hair, a torn flight attendant's uniform, staggered from the wreckage. Blood soaked her arm. She looked at me, dazed, lips trembling. "Oh God," she whispered. You're alive." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. Instead, I nodded. More movement. A groan. A man crawled out from under a broken row of seats. A muscular guy with a military crew cut, his forehead gashed open. His breathing was heavy, controlled. Even now, he looked focused. "How many?" I croaked. He scanned the bodies, his expression grim. "Not enough. 16 of us. That was it. Out of 127 passengers, only 16 had survived." The ex-military guy, Carter, had already started organizing the survivors. There was the flight attendant, Emily. The businessman, Thomas. The single mother, Laura, and her 14-year-old son, Jake. A handful of others, students, tourists, a middle-aged woman with a broken leg. "We need supplies," Carter announced, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Anything we can salvage, food, clothing, medical kits. Move." No one argued. We picked through the wreckage, searching for anything useful. The food cart had been obliterated on impact. What little we found, some miniature liquor bottles, crushed protein bars, half-frozen sandwiches, wouldn't last more than a few days. And then there was the cold. The wind was merciless, biting through our torn clothing. Some survivors wrapped themselves in seat covers or the remnants of coats found in the wreckage. But it wouldn't be enough. It was going to get colder. As the sun dipped below the peaks, we gathered near the remaining fuselage, using metal scraps to block the wind. "We should stay here," Emily insisted, hugging her wounded arm. "Rescue teams will come looking." Carter shook his head. "We don't know if anyone knows we're alive. We might have to make our way down." Thomas scoffed. "And go where? We don't even know where we are." The argument ripped through the group. Stay and wait, or head into the wilderness in search of help. I stayed quiet. because I knew something the others hadn't accepted yet. We weren't just fighting the elements. We were starving. That night, the first real sign of danger appeared. A man named Peter had survived the crash with a broken leg. We had moved him inside the fuselage, wrapped him in what little fabric we had. He moaned in pain, fading in and out of consciousness. By morning, he was dead. But it wasn't the cold that killed him. Carter was the first to notice. He crouched near the body, studying the wound on Peter's throat. There was too much blood. His neck had been slit. A hush fell over the group. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jesus Christ, Emily whispered. Laura pulled her son closer. Jake was trembling, eyes darting between us. It was the cold, right? One of the other survivors asked weakly. Maybe he just... No. Carter stood. His voice was flat. Final. This was deliberate. Silence. A pit opened in my stomach. We had been so focused on surviving the crash, the cold, the hunger. We hadn't realized what was already among us. We weren't alone. Someone had killed him, and that meant they'd do it again. By the 7th day, we had given up on rescue. The cold was worse than the hunger. It gnawed at us constantly, sinking into our bones. The wind never stopped screaming, and those without proper clothing had begun to change. Cheeks darkened by frostbite, fingers stiff and blue. But it was the hunger that turned us against each other. We had long since rationed the last scraps of food. Our bodies were eating themselves, muscles wasting away. The only thing that kept us moving was the thought that someone among us was a killer. Peter's death had shattered the fragile trust between us. No one spoke of it directly, but at night, we took turns keeping watch. Nobody wanted to be the next to have their throats slit. Thomas, the businessman, seemed to be the most comfortable with our situation. Too comfortable. We need to be rational, he kept saying. We can't just burn through our resources like animals. We have to think ahead. Rationing, he called it, but it felt more like hoarding. Thomas had been the first to divide the food properly, doling out portions, keeping track of what remained. But now there was nothing left, and yet, he still looked stronger than the rest of us. That night, Carter called a meeting inside the wreckage. We need to move, he said bluntly. Sitting here is suicide. No one argued. The snow was deeper than ever, and the wreckage provided little warmth. If we stayed, we'd freeze or starve before anyone found us. But Laura, the mother, shook her head. We don't know what's out there. And what about Peter? Nobody answered. We all knew what she meant. Whoever had killed Peter was still among us. Carter exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Fine, then we need to address the real issue. His gaze flickered to Thomas. You've been controlling the food supply since the beginning. Where the hell is it coming from? The tension snapped. What the hell are you implying? Thomas scoffed. We all agreed to ration. There's nothing left to ration. And yet, you're still going strong. Eyes turned toward Thomas. He glared at Carter, but his lips were dry, cracking. Then Emily, the flight attendant, spoke. Her voice was hoarse. I saw him eating something yesterday. Thomas's face darkened. You're hallucinating. Carter stood. Then you won't mind us searching your things. For a second, I thought Thomas was going to fight him. His fists clenched. His nostrils flared. Then, without a word, he turned out his pockets. They were empty. But Carter wasn't satisfied. He tore through the wreckage where Thomas had been sleeping, yanking back pieces of metal, shoving aside suitcases. And then he found it. A small stash of food, half-eaten crackers, a protein bar, 3 small bottles of liquor. It wasn't much, but in this world, it was everything. The silence was suffocating. Thomas swallowed. His lips twitched. I was going to share it. Carter punched him. The force of the blow sent Thomas sprawling, blood spraying across the snow. The rest of us just watched, because Carter wasn't just hitting him for stealing food. He was hitting him because all of us wanted to. That night, we were supposed to take shifts on watch. But by morning, one of us was missing. A woman named Danielle, a tourist maybe in her early 30s. She had been quiet, barely speaking since the crash. That morning, she was just gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the wreckage. But there was blood, a faint, uneven trail leading into the trees. No one wanted to follow it. Carter did. He He grabbed a makeshift torch and stalked toward the tree line. I hesitated, then forced myself to follow. The blood led deeper. The trees swallowed us. Every step felt like a mistake. The snow crunched beneath our boots, loud enough to give away our presence. The deeper we went, the older the forest felt. Gnarled trees twisted upward like skeletal fingers. And for the first time, I felt like we weren't alone. Then we found it, a patch of disturbed snow. Dark. Vet. Something had been dragged here. Carter knelt, touching the ground. The blood was still warm. I took a step back. My stomach turned. Something had taken her. Jesus carter muterid. We turned back. When we got to camp, everyone was watching us, eyes wide. Laura was clutching Jake, whispering frantically to him. Emily looked pale. Thomas sat in the snow, silent. No one asked what we had seen. No one wanted to know, because Danielle was gone, and no one knew who would be next. By the 9th day, people stopped talking. The hunger changed us. Our bodies had eaten through whatever fat we had left, and now even standing felt impossible. The cold had slowed our minds. Some people sat, staring at nothing. Jake, the boy, kept looking toward the woods. I asked him why. He wouldn't answer. And then I realized why. It wasn't just hunger that had stolen our words. It was the silence. No one wanted to say it. No one wanted to speak the truth. But we knew. There was nothing left to eat, and rescue wasn't coming. We were going to die here. Unless... I stopped myself. No. I pushed the thought away. We're not there yet. We're not animals. But then I looked at Thomas, at the way his sunken eyes lingered on Laura. And I knew. Some of us weren't willing to wait. On the 12th day, Carter spoke the words no one wanted to say. If someone dies, we have to use them. No one responded at first. The wind howled through the wreckage, shaking the twisted metal walls that barely shielded us from the cold. I could see the exhaustion in everyone's faces, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, bones pressing against thin, frostbitten skin. We had been dying slowly. Laura, the single mother, clutched Jake's arm, shaking her head. No, absolutely not. Emily, the flight attendant, swallowed hard. There has to be another way. Carter didn't waver. There isn't. The silence after his words was suffocating. Even Thomas, who had been so eager to control the food before, kept his mouth shut. But I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. Or maybe something worse. We weren't at the breaking point yet, but we were close. That night, Carter set the rule. No one kills. If someone dies, naturally, then, and only then, would we use the body. Laura still refused to be part of it. I won't eat another person, she hissed. Neither will Jake. Jake didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at his hands, his breath shallow. No one pushed them, but we all knew that if it came to it, the decision wouldn't be theirs to make. On the 14th day, a man named David didn't wake up. His body was frozen stiff. His fingers were black with frostbite. His lips were cracked open, his last breath still caught in the ice on his face. No one spoke for a long time. We had all been waiting for this. The moment Carter stood and lifted his knife, Laura grabbed Jake and stormed out into the snow. I followed her, my legs trembling from hunger and cold. Laura, she whirled on me, her face twisted with fury. We're not animals, Daniel. I didn't have the strength to argue. Then what are we? Her lips parted, but she had no answer. Behind us, I heard the first cut, the sound of skin tearing. The wind carried away the smell, but in my head, I could already taste it. Some refused. Laura and Jake stayed as far from the wreckage as possible. Emily barely spoke, wrapping herself in layers of clothing and refusing to meet anyone's gaze. I held off as long as I could, but hunger is stronger than morality. The first bite didn't feel real. It was cooked over a small fire, nothing but thin slivers of charred flesh. The taste was neither good nor bad, just food. I hated myself for it. Some part of me expected to feel different, to feel some irreversible shift in my soul, some mark of damnation. But I felt nothing. I had never realized how easy it would be. Not everyone had the same hesitation. Thomas was the first to eat, and the first to ask for more. At first, I convinced myself it was just survival, just practical thinking. But then, on the 17th day, I woke up to find another person missing. A woman named Grace. Thomas sat by the fire, chewing something between his teeth. She wandered off, he said. No one questioned it. But as I turned away, I noticed something behind the wreckage. A trail, not footsteps, drag marks, and the last shred of my hope died. That night, I didn't sleep. The wind howled, and the snow fell heavier than ever. But I barely felt the cold anymore, because something was happening in the dark corners of the wreckage. People were no longer waiting for death, and some were starting to enjoy it. Laura and Jake were gone by morning. The spot where they had been sleeping was empty, their makeshift bedding buried under a thin layer of fresh snow. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, just absence. At first, I let myself believe they had left, that Laura had finally had enough and taken Jake into the wild, desperate to find help. But deep down, I knew better. When I looked at Thomas, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We can't waste time looking for them," he said. "We have to focus on survival." No one argued. No one even asked where they went, because everyone knew, and no one wanted to admit that we had crossed a line we could never return from. Thomas had won. It had happened gradually. Carter had once been our leader, but his strength had faded with hunger. And Thomas, ruthless, calculating Thomas, had stepped into the void. He no longer suggested things. He decided them. And now his rules were simple. The weak feed the strong. We stopped waiting for nature to take its course. When someone became too weak, when they could no longer contribute, they disappeared in the night. No one spoke of it, but we all heard the screams. And soon, there were fewer and fewer of us left. I still had enough of myself left to feel guilt. I should have done something. I should have saved them. Instead, I had let Laura and Jake vanish into the belly of this place. And I had done nothing. That was when I decided to leave. Emily, the flight attendant, was the only one I trusted. She was barely holding on, her once sharp features sunken with hunger. But her eyes still had life in them. "We can't stay here," I told her that night, our voices barely whispers. She nodded. "They're going to come for us next." We didn't need to say who. We planned quickly. Before dawn, as quietly as possible, we gathered whatever supplies we could, half a bottle of liquor, a tattered blanket, a shard of metal that could serve as a weapon. Then we ran. The snow slowed us down, but fear kept us moving. The cold cut into my lungs, every breath like swallowing glass. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Behind us, I heard shouts. They had noticed, and they were coming. The chase was brutal. Emily stumbled first, and I grabbed her arm, yanking her forward. But they were gaining on us. Thomas's voice rang out through the trees. "Come back. Don't make this harder than it has to be." We kept running, and then Emily screamed. I turned just in time to see her yanked backward, disappearing into the snow. Hands clamped over her mouth, dragging her away. Her muffled cries pierced the air. I reached for her, but someone tackled me. The world spun, and suddenly I was on my back, fists pummeling my ribs. A knee pressed into my chest. I couldn't breathe. Thomas loomed over me, his breath fogging in the cold. "You should have stayed," he said. I swung wildly, my fist connecting with his jaw. The impact was weak, but it was enough. He recoiled just for a second, and I ran. Emily's screams followed me as I disappeared into the trees. I didn't look back. I ran until my body gave out. The cold wrapped around me, numbing everything. My fingers were stiff, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I collapsed against a tree, my vision swimming. I was alone. Emily was gone, and I had left her. Tears burned in my eyes, but I had no strength left to cry. I was going to die here. And then I saw it, a shape in the snow, a body. I crawled forward, my heart breaking as I recognized her. Laura. Her skin was pale, her eyes open and glassy. Her stomach was gone, stripped away, ribs exposed to the cold air. I choked on my own breath. And then, a movement. Something stirred beneath the snow. I froze. Then, with trembling fingers, I brushed the snow away. And I found Jake. His body was cold, his lips blue, but his chest rose. He was alive. Barely. And I knew then. I wasn't alone. Not yet. The wreckage had been buried under ice and snow for years. At first glance, it didn't look like much, just twisted metal, shards of glass, and the remnants of a plane long forgotten by the world. The search efforts had ended long ago. No one had ever come looking again, but the hikers had found it. They had been following an old, barely legible topographical map, hoping to reach the highest ridgeline before the weather turned. Instead, they had stumbled upon something else. The remnants of a camp. The air was eerily still. Bones littered the snow-covered ground, some half-buried, others scattered near a rusted-out fire pit. There was no sign of who they had once belonged to. No names, no graves. Only the quiet remnants of something dark. And then one of them, a woman named Erin, found the diary. It was wedged between the frozen remains of an old seat, its pages brittle, its cover torn and stained. The name on the inside cover was barely legible. Daniel Carter. Erin flipped to the last written page, the ink shaky, the handwriting uneven. The words were the final testament of a man who had died in this place. And the more she read, the worse it got. If someone finds this, then I am gone. The cold is getting worse. I can't feel my hands. I don't know how much time I have left. I tried to save him. I swear I tried, but they took him. They took the boy. Erin's breath hitched. She looked up at the others, her hands trembling as she turned another page. The entry was dated over a decade ago. The ink had begun to fade, but the words were still there. We ran. I carried him as far as I could, but they caught up to us. The last of them, the ones who had stopped pretending they were still people. I don't know what happened to Jake. I only remember the sound of his screams as they dragged him away. They left me here. I was already half dead, and they knew I wouldn't last long. But I can still hear them. Not the ones I knew. Not Carter. Not Emily. Not even Thomas. Something else. Something that was always here. A gust of wind howled through the valley, and Erin shivered. We should go, one of the hikers muttered. But she wasn't listening anymore, because the next few lines, Daniel Carter's final words, had sent ice crawling up her spine. I thought we were alone out here, that we were just victims of the crash, of the cold, of our own hunger. But we weren't alone. We never were. They were watching, waiting. I see them now, in the trees. Erin looked up, and beyond the wreckage, past the bones and the frozen remnants of a nightmare, something moved. The trees swayed, though there was no wind. A shadow shifted just out of reach. The others hadn't noticed. Not yet. Her heart pounded. She wanted to say something, to warn them, to tell them to run. But the words caught in her throat, because suddenly the mountains didn't feel empty anymore. Suddenly, it felt like they had never left at all.